So we're just going to get started in one moment. Omar will start with a disclaimer. No, we can't hear you now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. A short disclaimer: the information presented here is for the purpose of informing the board. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or any board member. We are recording today's session. You will be able to access it on our website at ssab.gov. Questions and comments are welcomed and encouraged and can be submitted via the Zoom Q&A function or email us at events@ssab.gov. You can also tweet us using our handle at @ssabgov. Feedback is also welcome and can be sent via email to events@ssab.gov. And with that, I will hand it over to our board chair, Bob Joondav.
Thanks very much, Omar. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Social Security Advisory Board, I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of the board's fiscal year 2022 speaker series. Information technology plays an integral role in SSA's achieving its mission: delivery of quality Social Security services to the public. In the fall of 2019, the board commissioned an IT systems expert panel to evaluate SSA's IT modernization efforts. The board has continued to explore this critical area of activity by bringing in IT experts to meet with the board and the public as part of our systems speaker series. And this morning, we have two IT acquisitions experts speaking with us: Laura Stanton and Bill Zielinski. Laura is the Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Information Technology category in GSA's Federal Acquisition Service, overseeing more than 6,000 contracts, providing access to IT and telecommunications products, services, and solutions. Their customers include defense and civilian agencies and state, local, and tribal governments. Laura also served as Associate Commissioner of GSA's Office of Enterprise Strategy Management and as Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Category Management, managing a broad portfolio of acquisition solutions. Our other speaker today is Bill Zielinski. Bill served as the Assistant Commissioner for the General Services Administration's Federal Acquisition Services in the Office of Information Technology. Prior to this role, Bill provided oversight of the federal government's IT capital planning and investment control process for the federal CIO. He also served as the CIO for the Social Security Administration between 2013 and 2015, and currently continues his public service as CIO for the city of Dallas in Texas. Both of our presenters bring a wealth of experience on today's topic of discussion, IT acquisitions, and we're grateful for their participation in our speaker series and are very anxious to hear what they have to share with us today. During the presentation, Laura and Bill will open it up for questions from board and staff. And there will be an ongoing process of soliciting questions from public participants and time for folks to be reminded that there's opportunities to ask questions, and we'll try to get to all of those. Please remember that our speakers' biographies are available on our website and have been added to our chat messaging. Now to our speakers, we thank you for joining us this morning, and I turn it over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you so much to the Social Security Advisory Board for the invitation to speak on IT category management. And I will give Bill a chance to sort of open it up as well. I do want to mention that our presentation today is broken into two parts. The first part is very focused on sort of the concept of category management, some of the work that we're doing across the government-wide space, the priorities, how it supports policies and cybersecurity across the government. The second half of the presentation is very much focused on analysis of SSA and how SSA's profile in IT spend compares to other profiles across the government. And so we'll be breaking, and please, as was stated, please put in questions into the chat throughout and so on. But we will, Bill and I will be tag teaming the presentation, and we will be breaking sort of after the category management section and opening it up for questions at that point. And then again at the very end. That's sort of a natural halfway point in the presentation. But I am thrilled to be here. As Bob said, I am the Assistant Commissioner of the IT category. We work with 98% of the federal agencies across the government. We also work with state, local, and tribal governments to support them in their IT needs. Last year in FY21, $32 billion went through the contracts and programs that are managed out of the IT category. And I also have the dual role of the government-wide IT category manager. So not only am I looking at it from all of the aspects of what I manage within GSA, but I'm also looking at it across the government-wide IT spend, which I'll get into more details of what that looks like, and looking at how does the government approach IT acquisition and what can be done to benefit the government. From that, I am following in the footsteps of Bill Zielinski, who has held both of these positions before I did. So let me pass it over to Bill to give a chance to introduce himself.
Great, thank you, Laura, appreciate it. And I want to thank the board for inviting me to speak with you all today. Again, my name is Bill Zielinski, and I'm the Chief Information Officer for the City of Dallas, Texas. As has been mentioned, prior to that, I was in the role that Laura is currently in with the General Services Administration. But I began my career, my 30-year federal career, as a claims representative in Social Security's Bremerton, Washington, now Kitsap office, field office. And I actually took and processed claims for supplemental security income and Social Security benefits. More than 20 of my 30 years in the federal government were spent with the Social Security Administration in a variety of different roles, to include executive and senior management positions. As was stated, my last position with SSA was as the Chief Information Officer, but I also served as the Regional Commissioner for the agency's San Francisco region. My experience with SSA is that it is a noble institution with a great mission. It's filled with good, capable, and hardworking people that are dedicated to its mission in serving the people that rely on the services, on the vital services that it administers. But I also know the agency as one that has faced significant challenges in pivoting from a traditionally and primarily brick and mortar storefront service delivery to one that needs to seamlessly incorporate a digital service delivery model. And it's my belief that Social Security can and will benefit from leveraging the kinds of government-wide services and programs that Laura and I are going to speak about today to improve the outcomes that it achieves through the application of technology. So accelerating deployment, reducing risk, and having a greater alignment to proven industry best practices are some of the benefits to be realized from being able to leverage these government-wide programs. And so today, Laura and I are prepared to discuss with the board this government-wide acquisition services and talk about it in the context of SSA. So again, thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all today.
All right, thank you, Bill. So next slide, please, Jeremy. I wanted to start with an overview of category management. And Bill, certainly, as I said, we planned on tag teaming this. So Bill will be also joining me in illustrating points to a greater degree. But wanted to walk through sort of the category management is a strategic approach for how an organization is organized to buy goods and services as a vendor as a single entity. And in the case of the federal government, we're talking about the federal government acting as that single entity. For the last several years, the government has spent over $600 billion a year on goods and services. And more than half of that spending is for goods and services that are considered common across federal agencies. And these include things such as training, overnight delivery services, copier machines, travel services, and also many of the IT solutions and software and hardware options that we'll be discussing today. However, what often happens is that these are purchased individually by over 3,000 buying offices and 40,000 contractors across the government. So category management is the idea that buying as one gives the opportunity the federal government to leverage its buying power as a large customer, and that this could also reduce the need for vendors to constantly bid on redundant work. The government has implemented category management for common goods and services, and I'll get into what that looks like in a couple of slides. And today I'm providing an overview of that on the IT category, and as I said earlier, reviewing SSA's spend profile compared to other agencies. So from the government's point of view, some of the actions that we're taking that are involved in category management is that identification of core categories of spend, of which IT is one of them, professional services is another, industrial products is a third, but we will be focusing predominantly on wholly on IT today. It's also taking data to understand what's being bought, how it's being bought, and also reduce the number of contracts when possible. And notice I say reduce the number of contracts. This is not reducing the number of suppliers to the federal government. This is reducing the number of duplicate contracts that companies are expected to have. We also want to be better managing suppliers and demand and approaching them consistently versus every agency coming in with individual requests. And we'll talk about what that looks like as we implement some of these policies going forward. And then also reducing the total cost of ownership on products, services, and solutions. From the industry point of view, next slide, please. Category management offers value for industry because just to give a very simplistic example, the more that the buyer knows about the industry that they're buying from, the more that the requirements that buyer is putting out to industry can align to the commercial practice in as many ways as possible. We recognize that the government's always going to have some unique requirements that are different from commercial practice. However, there are opportunities to fully align. And let me give a very, very basic example. Imagine that you're buying pencils and that you're looking at and you've requested in your RFP, on your request for proposal, that the vendor provides you the pencils in bundles of 13. Well, when I did my research on pencil buying last night, pencils are either sold as a dozen or they're sold in increments of 10. So 13 means that company would have to decide, is it worth it to propose on this contract? Is it worth the extra cost that I'm going to have to take to create, to build, put together new boxes, to bundle everything differently than how I sell it to the private sector? And there's also a question, is there value even in selling it in that 13? I'm taking this to an extreme degree, but when the government steps away from commercial standards and commercial requirements, that adds cost, time, effort for the private sector, and it also reduces the number of suppliers who are willing to actually propose and work with the government because of that added complexity. So the idea is, let's build better requirements, more consistent requirements. Let's understand all the commercial standards for the industries that we're buying in. Let's use that as a way to reduce the burden for industry also by having government-wide contracts. And it also then becomes an opportunity to boost innovation for the government to better have that data to understand and have better transparency into how the industry sells. And it also then gives us an opportunity to fully analyze how small business plays into this market. So please.
Laura, if I could add just another example, the pencils example was a great one, but another example that we ran into, and you'll recall this, is that buying of laptops, right? Because the federal government would go to the market as individual buyers, what we found in utilizing the data and really peeling back that data to understand our buying habits and what we were doing we saw that the vast majority of purchases of laptops were happening in the very last quarter of the fiscal year. And so all of the agencies were going individually to the original equipment manufacturers or to the resellers that were representing those original equipment manufacturers, all in that very last quarter of the fiscal year. And what happened is that those original equipment manufacturers, to the point that you were making, they now had to spin up additional production lines. So they had to bring online new production in order to meet the demand. They also had to bring on board additional distribution channels to be able to distribute those within the timeframes that the federal government was asking for those. And what we saw both in looking at the data and working with those vendors is that the government as a whole, were driving up the individual unit cost of those laptops tremendously, because those costs that were associated with additional manufacture lines, as well as with additional distribution lines, those were all buried back into the costs of the devices. And being able to understand through that data and through that engagement with industry, what are those factors or those things that are driving up the costs in our requirement, we're able to put strategies in place that allowed for us to really get the best pricing available and the best delivery of those units by changing that manner in which we were purchasing those laptops. So I think those are, understanding that market demand and the power of the data is a key to this, Laura.
Absolutely. And also understanding how we even change our own demand internally. And that gets into software licensing. Are we managing all of our software licenses across the agencies, or do we have our licenses being bought and while other licenses go unused? That's another example of demand management on the government side, making sure that we're fully managing everything that we own, which goes back to the life cycle management piece, to ensure that when we're replacing it or buying additional, those are actual needs. So that's another sort of core example is software licensing management. And the next slide, please. Going into the government-wide categories, I talked about the 10 common categories, and this is not everything the government spends. There are another set of categories, 9 others that are specifically for defense-related categories. However, for the 10 government-wide categories here, you can see each one of them. You can see the category manager and what was spent in that category in FY21. In the IT category that we're focused on today, we spent $70 billion across the federal government in IT. I do want to note this is a drop. In FY20, $75 billion was spent. So we did see predominantly my assessment is that was related to the additional COVID spending that was put in place for the FY20 year. In FY21, we saw those obligations drop. So we will, in the next slide, within the IT category, we have 5 subcategories that we're looking at. The main one is, the largest of those categories is the IT services category at $43 billion. So it's significantly larger than the next largest, which is the IT software category, which had $11 billion spent in it last year. This becomes, many agencies are moving towards acquiring, both buying IT services, and that includes professional services, and that includes buying both platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and software as a service. So rather than buying their own software and putting it on their laptops, what they're doing is purchasing that software on a subscription basis and buying it as a service where it's maintained by the company. So we'll get into some of those differences and some of the benefits and approaches, but I did want to call out sort of that high level of IT services, that's where the bulk of the spend occurs across the federal government.
And Laura, if I could jump in, what we're really seeing in terms of this transition from the purchase of hard goods and products, right? So we talked about these are goods, commonly purchased goods and services. What you see in this reshaping in the IT world here is people are still getting laptops, right? But we're seeing much more purchasing of not the hard laptop itself, where I, as a CIO, am purchasing a bundle of laptops, imaging those, deploying those into the environment, but I'm actually contracting with a managed service provider, who the managed service provider is responsible for purchasing all of those laptops, doing the imaging and the deployment of them. That shifts that buying pattern when I go from buying the laptops myself to actually getting a managed service provider who takes care of my end user devices, takes care of my laptops. That now changes in the subcategories from hardware over into IT services. So increasingly over the last several years, we have seen that shift as we see more of an as a service delivery to include cloud-based services, but to also include these things like the management of functions like end user computing or device management into a service contract as opposed to a purchase of IT hardware. Thanks, Laura. I just thought that was an important distinction to help folks understand.
It is, and I just want to call out that while Bill's talking about sort of the distinction in what does the money look like and what does the spend profile look like, the distinction that he's talking about, and he could probably is also then affects how up to date those laptops are kept. It affects the acquisition and reinforces the importance of the acquisition, because you're moving the management of that laptop from in-house, either through contracted or federal personnel, to you're moving it to outsourced management. And so that then changes the acquisitions that you need to do. It also changes the profile of your workforce and what the workforce needs to do. So just wanted to call out that there's a whole slew of sort of implications that stem from those types of acquisition decisions and those transitions.
This is Jagadish. If I may just ask a quick question related to this point. I've always been curious about whether these managed acquisition services should be in-house or should be contracted out. There are advantages and disadvantages of both models. So it's not clear to me, and I don't know how the decision is made about, or are there any principles guiding this in this particular area? Thank you.
Yeah, so Laura, I will start first. I think you've hit the nail on the head when you said that there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those models. And knowing and understanding what the advantages and disadvantages are of each of those is an important consideration. Certainly, Laura and her team in the General Services Administration, through their experience, can help an agency or can help an entity understand where those decision points are. But as you shift that management model, what you need to ensure that you're doing is, if you're moving away from me as the CIO and my staff physically buying, purchasing, and managing those devices to where it's going to be through a managed service provider, you need to have really strong service level agreements in place. You need to have data that helps you understand what they are or not deploying. So since you're shifting that management of it, you need to make sure that your terms and conditions, your SLAs that you're putting into your contract are very clear in terms of what those expectations are, such as deployment timelines, response rates, the defect rates in the machines that they're applying. Because while you give them a technical specification, you also have to ensure that they know what your expectations are in terms of timeliness, responsiveness, those sorts of things. Again, Laura and her staff can help an agency go through those. But as a general rule of thumb, if I am a smaller organization where my ability to keep and maintain expertise on a particular domain area is difficult, because my cycles of hiring and recruiting and retaining staff, it may be more attractive to me to have a fully managed service where I can manage it through the contract specifications, and that vendor is then responsible for ensuring the refreshment of staff and those sorts of things. So there are some general guidelines, but it can be very specific to the particular organization and what their needs are. But that was a great point in terms of, as you shift on that model, you need to be aware of what the advantages and disadvantages of each are, so that you ensure that you're building your contract to account for those.
I would also add in one additional piece, which is it does get into it also should align to the customer experience and to the vision of how you want the organization operating. And those are very much, those are individual decisions inside of agencies that help align in not only how do you determine what gets outsourced for management, what is managed internally, but it also helps set the acquisition for all the reasons that Bill said. It helps determine what those SLAs are, what the performance looks like. So just wanted to help to add that piece in. We will be touching back on acquisitions are always done in service of a larger vision and related to the program management of what an agency is going for, so that they need to be crafted with that in mind.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. So one of the core tenets of category management is understanding sort of how the spend is how the dollars are looked at. And in March of 2019, the Office of Management and Budget released M1913, which is a memo directing agencies to increase their usage of common solutions and practices to improve better outcomes, specifically around IT modernization, improving data accountability, bringing decentralized data and acquisitions in line with organized government and agency practices. And just to be clear, category management has been the priority of the past 3 administrations. It was launched initially around the 2014-2015 timeframe, and subsequently it's consistently been part of the President's management agenda, and agencies are given targets for bringing spend under management. And as I said, I will review SSA's spend profile in light of this, but it's important to sort of understand these tiers because this is the framework in which we'll be talking about it. One of the primary goals of category management is to increase the spend under management by decreasing tier 0 solutions. And spend under management means that the money is being spent and allocated against contracts that have defined criteria for management maturity and data sharing. In really simple terms, category management classifies all procurement solutions or contracts within the tiers that are shown on this slide. So if an agency uses a tier 1, 2, or 3 solution to make a contract award, it's considered spend under management. And the sum designation means that the contract meets some of these best practices, that they follow vendor management and industry engagement best practices when interacting with the private sector for all the reasons that we've just discussed over the last few minutes. And that they understand what's happening with that product or service or solution that they're acquiring. That they're developing better policies and practices around the contract, product, or service. And that they're coordinating with their Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization to look at and optimize opportunities for small and socioeconomic businesses. So each of these means the contracting officer can maximize the likelihood that they're getting a good deal for the taxpayer, and that they're reducing the redundant contracts when they're using some designated contracts. And so in this case, tier 0 means that the contracts are not aligned with the consolidated buying strategy. They're sort of one-off contracts. Tier 1 is that it's aligned with an agency's specific buying strategy or a strategic small business buying approach. Tier 2 are government-wide contracts, multi-agency contracts that meet a set of standards for strategy, data, tools, metrics, and also any contracts with small disadvantaged businesses earn automatic tier 2 credit. And then finally, sort of the cream of the crop are what are considered the tier 3, which are the best in class contracts, which meet a very rigorous criteria for defining requirements, appropriate pricing. They use data to measure data performance. They have tools associated with them. And it also means that those contracts are providing transactional data back to the federal government so that we can do continuous analysis on how things are being acquired. So the next slide, please. We also use category management to help translate policies into action. And so not only am I, from my category manager role, I'm working across all of the GSA contracts to make this happen, but I'm also working across all 14 best-in-class IT contracts within the federal government. And this helps agencies operate more efficiently by reducing the administrative and the contract duplication. So collectively, as a category, as an IT category, we're looking to translate the recent executive orders on racial equity, Buy Americans, supply chain, climate crisis, cybersecurity into a set of actions for these vehicles, vendors, and agencies to be able to support them. And specifically, we'll be focusing on racial equity and cybersecurity during today's conversation. And I'll also talk about the strategic initiatives that we're doing in the FY22 category management plan, which will be published later, which will be published next month, that will be supporting the implementation of these executive orders. So this is where, and then we manage it through the contract management, the supplier management, and ultimately use a whole series of metrics that you see there down at the bottom to be able to reshape the federal IT spend.
So Laura, in practical, as a practical matter, what does this mean, right? And I'll kind of throw out there what this practically means. You talked about those best-in-class government-wide contracts, and you talked here about how those best-in-class contracts work in conjunction with, or there's a nexus between those government-wide contracts and these various sundry policies, or these various sundry legislative items that come through. In practicality, what this means is that those best-in-class contracts are pre-competed contracts in which the General Services Administration has set the floor for terms and conditions. In other words, if you look at the supply chain aspects or the cybersecurity or the Buy America, all of the requirements under these programs are all negotiated into the base contracts that are represented in those best-in-class contracts. So when an agency uses these contracts, that means that they are guaranteed to meet all of the requirements of these programs because they have been built in from the very beginning. What it also means is that in these contracts, the General Services Administration has set the ceiling for the pricing. So as an agency utilizes the contract, they don't have to renegotiate any of these terms and conditions, but they can negotiate for better pricing. So from a practical matter, all of the work that's done upfront once by the General Services Administration on a best-in-class contract, all of the agencies who use them have the benefit of not having to renegotiate or go back through these things and ensure they're part of it, because all of these are built in, but there's an opportunity to negotiate for better pricing. So just from a practical matter, that's where there's the benefit of doing that work once and having it leveraged by many agencies many times over.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate the sort of the additional information. I get so immersed in this that sometimes I forget I forget those pieces of it, but that's a great addition. Thank you. Moving on to the next set. So part of the request when Bill and I sat down initially to talk about what we would discuss today was about a whole set of resources that also could be beneficial, and sort of moving from the framing of category management, but into the next slide that talks about the government-wide initiatives, and we'll begin talking about the resources as we move into the next sort of phase of category management in this presentation. And the reason I bring these up is these are some of the key government initiatives. You see on here the laptop desktop effort that Bill alluded to earlier, which is really focused on not only setting sort of a baseline standard for the requirements of laptops and desktops across the federal government to simplify acquisitions with the top original equipment manufacturers. And the team that runs this is on version 8 of that standard. And they are working with the top hardware manufacturers. They're working with CIO representatives from the 24 CFO Act agencies. to really look at what does the government need for specifications and configurations of laptops and desktops to get back to that set of common requirements. And then they're able to understand what the manufacturing cycle is. All of the things that Bill walked through earlier that talked about ways to take cost and out of the acquisition and to streamline the acquisition process. And also reduce friction with our industry partners when it comes to these acquisitions. I also wanted to focus, cybersecurity is certainly a hot topic. And we also have, one of the efforts is to move our highly adaptive cybersecurity services into best in class. So we're able to capture all of that transactional data. And this is a common solution that's on our multiple awards schedule that gives agencies an access of technically evaluated cybersecurity vendors. There's rapid ordering and deployment of services. There's a reduction in open market ordering then and contract duplication because these companies only have to maintain the multiple awards schedule. And then also there's access to cybersecurity and acquisition support resources from GSA. So that's another core area where we're focusing this upcoming year. Cloud, we talked, Bill alluded earlier to cloud and the importance of being able to use cloud to for a number of uses, for anything from infrastructure to platform to software. And what we've been doing in GSA is working across the federal government to understand how agencies are not only acquiring, but also how they're managing cloud on the back end. And as a result of that market research and customer research that we're doing, we're embarking on a multi-year build out of a cloud marketplace to improve the buying and selling experience of cloud services through GSA programs and contract vehicles. We're gathering information from industry on that, and we're gathering information from the federal agencies to adjust our acquisition approach and scope. And we're going to be going out and doing an industry day on that in the next month or two. So we'll be releasing a draft solicitation and ultimately following that up with the industry day. So really focusing on improved acquiring and management of cloud services as many agencies are migrating in that direction. CSCRM is the Cybersecurity Supply Chain Risk Management effort. We're working closely with a number of original equipment manufacturers to mitigate vendor concentration risks. And we're also looking at evaluating our IT contracts and vendors against cybersecurity supply chain risk management requirements. So all of these are feeding back into those sets of common solutions that we talked about, which would be the tier 2 or the tier 3 best in class vehicles. And then the final government-wide initiative is very much focused on small business utilization and continuing to look at how do we best support small businesses, where are the best opportunities in the IT government-wide category for them to participate, and what's the appropriate, and reaching out to them so they can understand best how to work within the federal IT marketplace. Bill, did you have anything you wanted to add on these?
Yeah, so Laura, the one thing that I would really add here is that that I would highlight a little bit further what you're mentioning about the partnerships that exist in each of these. So whether you're looking at highly adaptive cybersecurity services or the CSCRM, the Cybersecurity Supply Chain Risk Management, these programs or these initiatives, they were not developed in isolation by GSA simply looking at either the laws, the regulations, or the guidance that's coming out from the Office of Management and Budget. You all are actively working with those in the space. So for HACS, for the highly adaptive cybersecurity services, you're utilizing the NIST framework. You're working closely with individuals from NIST as well as with those from the Department of Homeland Security, and actually building out those programs to assure that they align very directly. So these are, these things are really being created to be easy buttons to really serve as accelerators for agencies to be able to reach the types of goods and services that they need. but they're being done in coordination and in conjunction and with the direct support of those who have the most responsibility in that space as well. So I just wanted to point out that there's a lot of work being done across government to bring these programs into existence. So that means that, you know, it's like the good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will, because the folks who are responsible for government-wide are direct participants in these activities.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. That's and I would also add that even under cybersecurity supply chain risk management, we've recently launched two groups, two community of interests. One is a government-only acquisition community of practice to help agencies understand how to practically turn the cybersecurity requirements into and put them into their acquisitions as needed. The second group is an industry, academia, government group that is that we've established in partnership with ACT-IAC to be able to understand where industry is on this cybersecurity supply chain risk management, get their input, and work with them. So these are the types, and I'll talk in a minute about an IT buyers community of practice that we're preparing to launch. But these are the types of resources and programs that we're establishing to work across the government and help support all of the cybersecurity EO and some of the other policy changes that we'll talk a bit more about. Even yesterday, there was a new memorandum released by the Office of Management and Budget on Zero Trust Architecture Strategy that GSA is going to be supporting, and we have been supporting Zero Trust Architecture as well. So next slide, please. Another resource that we've stood up recently, and I will give Bill credit because he was the one who conceptualized it. And then he promptly handed it to me to execute. After as he left and moved to Dallas, but we set up a government-wide IT vendor management office, and this is the IT VMO launched in FY21, and it's one of our strategies for really approaching companies as an enterprise and understanding their needs, and also taking concerns and feedback to them, and getting and being able to have that representation as a federal government versus every agency having that conversation individually with the agency, with the companies. That becomes harder for them to both track, manage, and understand the extent of those requests. So we've been working specifically, the IT VMO has been working on the America's Supply Chain and Buy America EOs. We also have been working with with Microsoft and Oracle to, we did an assessment in FY21 using data calls. We chartered a cross-government working group, compiled market and data intelligence to understand sort of common challenges. And we also have worked with agency practitioners on contract lifecycle management practices, IT implementation and security, and negotiation tactics for a whole series of companies. And we've met to understand these common IT challenges and discuss the options to solve. In one case, the company provided access to their educational resources, and the IT vendor management office has been working to publish a guide to further share that out with the federal agencies. In February, the IT vendor management office will be holding a closeout webinar for the Microsoft and Oracle efforts, and working on sort of the next tranche of companies, which is we're partnering with Adobe, AWS, and ServiceNow. So that's certainly a source of information if you want to check out the itvmo.gsa.gov website, or reach out to the organization. The contact information is there. But this is a resource that is a result of the government-wide effort designed, as I said, to take category management to the next level.
And Laura, if I could, just a little side story of part of what guided my thinking in and around this actually goes back to a large, well-publicized kind of hack of a vendor, Equifax, back in the September of 2017 timeframe. And at that point in time, when it was discovered or determined that there was an infiltration and exfiltration of data from Equifax, the Department of Homeland Security called together government CIOs and myself, and we started having that conversation about, how do we work through this, Bill? What is our exposure? How many of the agencies have contracts with Equifax, and what do we do in terms of leveraging the contracts and the terms and conditions of the contract to open up that conversation with Equifax? And what the data showed is that we, the federal government, had hundreds of individual contracts with Equifax across dozens and dozens of agencies. And so it really left us in a position that each individual agency would have to go to Equifax to try to determine their individual exposure. And there really wasn't a way from a contractual perspective for us to really approach the vendor and have the ability to work with them in the way that we would if there was a consolidation of those contracts into one. And so as we start talking about these government-wide contracts, you start to look at the benefits both for industry, right? In that kind of situation, rather than getting hit by hundreds of agencies all trying to get some answers relative to the event, you can now have a vendor management, a broader government-wide IT vendor management office that is part of the approach to those vendors. So just that background on some of the benefits to both the government as well as to the industry for this kind of approach.
Excellent. Thank you. Next slide, please. I do want to, coming up in the next quarter, we're going to be launching the IT. Okay, I wasn't sure if that was just my screen that did that or everyone's. In the next quarter, we're going to be launching the IT Buyers Community of Practice. And this is going to be focused on both acquisition and IT professionals across the government to promote that knowledge sharing. We've really looked at, there's a cloud and infrastructure community of practice that's run out of GSA from the Office of Government-Wide Policy. We've looked at the Federal Technology Investment Community of Practice. These are really providing some incredibly valuable resources to the federal community who works with cloud and infrastructure, who works with technology investments. And we will be this IT Buyers Community of Practice will be working collectively with other government-wide groups to ensure that we're linking in and cross-pollinating the information. And the intent of the Buyers Community of Practice is going to be to be able to gather feedback directly on agency challenges, provide a forum to collectively work across those agencies and contracts in order to be able to address those challenges. And we will also be communicating outputs such as the vendor assessment reviews that I just talked about, understand what other opportunities there are to help smooth over relationships and work together, knowledge share, and we'll be maintaining an online portal for these participants as well. So just really looking forward to getting that launched and beginning that active engagement from the community who's on the front lines of acquiring and managing the IT across the government. So next slide, please. Just wanted to highlight, I think we've already hit on a couple of these. So just in the interest of time, because we are running long, I'll just say that we did have a couple of successes where we were able to, we've talked about that desktop and laptop one already. We did have an opportunity to work with the Council of the IGs. So rather than putting in their own contract, they put together a blanket purchase agreement to support 70 OIG offices across the government. And those are the types of efforts that are successful for category management. Next slide, please. And then finally, wanted to, I've alluded to this, that really we're looking at how do we support the small disadvantaged business contracting goals in partnership with the SBA. And this also supports the executive order and the memo M2203, which is advancing equity in federal procurement. that also establishes awards for small disadvantaged businesses as spend under management. So we're also working across the government to adjust category management practices to make sure that we're giving opportunities and identifying also the IT landscape to look for the best opportunities for SDBs to be able to participate. And we're out there doing outreach to bring in new entrants to the federal marketplace. And just one point is, this is important enough that it is considered, it is part of the performance plans of key senior executive service members to be able to continue to increase the engagement with the small business and the SDB community. Next slide, please. This is sort of the natural break point that I mentioned in the presentation before we move into the SSA spend profile. So let me pause, see if Bill has anything to sort of say in summation, and then open it up for any questions that the board might have.
And Laura, the only thing that I would add is the concept of category management has been around for decades, right? It first got its start in the 80s. Industry began adopting category management principles in the 90s, and so it's not something that has been drummed up by the U.S. federal government. It's a long-standing industry best practice that the federal government has brought in to look at common goods and services. So as you said, Laura, it's looking specifically at common goods and services. So there's plenty of room for choices outside of that, but I just wanted to make sure that those 2 points were clear.
Thanks, Bill. Any questions at the, any questions at this point?
Laura and Bill, my name is Kim Hilder, and I'm one of the board members. And I wanted to make sure that I'm clear on a couple of things. So what I'm hearing is federal agencies are not required to use GSA for purchasing, IT-related purchasing, but there's a mandate out there for them to increase their use of your services. Is that a fair way to put it?
So GSA, so thank you, Kim. Couple of points on that. There's a mandate for agencies to increase their spend under management. And they can do that, and to get a certain amount of spend within the best, in those tier 3 best in class contracts. And GSA provides many of those best in class contracts. However, we do not provide all of them. And so there are other contracts out there. For example, NASA SOUP, which provides IT hardware. NIH, NITAC provides IT services. So there are other best-in-class contracts for agencies to use to achieve that tier 3 spend. What I would add is that there, as we went through sort of the benefits of of bringing the spend under management and moving up those tier levels. But there's multiple ways that agencies can do that.
Okay, and then if an agency chooses to obtain, say, IT services through GSA, does GSA manage the contract? Do they become the contract officer, or is that still at the agency's responsibility? Just talk a little bit about that so I can be clear.
No, thank you for the question. So GSA manages the master. So my organization manages the master contracts, which would be, they're referred to as, the programs are the multiple awards schedules programs, or the government-wide acquisition contracts, which are IT services contracts. The agency can use those contracts themselves and have their own contracting officer write the task order and manage that task order. Or they can use another organization within GSA called the Assisted Acquisition Service if they need to have support, both contract and program and project management support. And in that case, GSA would be the contracting officer in managing the task order. But it's not required to use GSA's contracts that we have to manage that.
Okay.
And Laura, for
discretion to keep control.
And Laura, for the Kim, by the way, good to see you again. And Laura, for the the agencies are the contract holders. At the end of the day, whether they're using the GSA contracts or not, it's the agency who owns that contract. There is a shared relationship in terms of managing it over the period of performance. And what I mean by that is on the day-to-day delivery of the services, the agency is working directly with the vendors that they have contracted with for a delivery of those services. If there are disputes or issues relative to the terms and conditions of the contract that was built on top of the GSA base contract, if it's an issue surrounding whether or not the vendor has properly followed the terms and conditions of the base contract, then GSA does provide support for those types of issues. So there's some kind of co-management of that contract depending upon what the issue is. Laura, if I've misrepresented any of that, please correct me.
No, I think there's always would be, I mean, the agency, absolutely, especially when the agency chooses to do the contract, have their contracting officer use the GSA contracts. They maintain maximum control over those, but they always have control over the requirements and the management.
And I would think that there would be, I'm thinking about like, let's just say a federal agency were to come to you to use your services, Laura, and they were asking for something that's, I don't know, really outdated or behind the times or those kinds of things. Are your staff involved in kind of almost like consulting with them a little bit in terms of, well, I know you're asking for this, but you may want to think about that so that they can up their game if they don't know how to up their game?
Yes, so out of my staff, I have sort of a split between acquisition professionals, contracting officers and contracting specialists and IT specialists. And so there's a significant amount of IT expertise that if agencies ask for us to review, to support them on requirements development and for consulting services, we do provide that type of feedback and support.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And last question, your services are available to all federal agencies, even micro agencies, or is there any type of restriction?
We're available to all federal agencies and within some conditions, state, local, and tribal governments.
Okay, great.
Some limitations there, but all federal agencies.
Thank you so much. As a taxpayer, this is very exciting.
I have a somewhat related question, and that is, first of all, this has been extremely informative. So thank you for so far. You know, I can see that agency heads, from their perspective, can see the advantages of the service you're providing. I can also, in this joint contracting, but I can also see agencies saying, you know, we have our own mission, we've got our own particular needs, and also there's of course inertia. To what extent, if you can generalize, have you found that agencies are really buying into this vision and taking advantage of it, or are really resistant and continuing sort of on their own?
So my response to that is that we've definitely been seeing an increase of spend under management and of usage of best in class since we've launched category management. And I think that, you know, we've seen some real examples of agencies shifting from saying, I insist on having my own contract, my own indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract, to saying, I'm going to develop a strategy where I rely on GSA. And so it's been a shift. And it's been over time though, we've definitely seen agencies stepping away from having their own contract vehicles. What I would also add is we've also seen agencies that have used GSA, they step away from us because they are more comfortable doing it themselves. And now we see them returning to GSA because of the benefits. So this is absolutely, it's a journey, but and to address your comment, Nancy, about that agencies have unique requirements. Absolutely, that is acknowledged that agencies have requirements that are agency specific, mission specific. And that's one of the reasons why really only a percentage of the agency's spend is sort of at that tier 3 level, because they want to acknowledge that not everything's common. But for the common things, there's all the advantages of using those government-wide contracts for the management, for the data, for the industry benefits. Bill, you want to
yes.
add?
Yeah, so Nancy, I think that's a fantastic question. Laura hit on the idea of, we're really talking about common goods and services, right? If there's some highly specialized, very unique and specific, then this is not the best approach. And there's plenty of room in here to make those choices and decisions. I will tell you that the data is a very powerful piece of it. I have sat down with an agency CIO and an agency chief procurement officer and actually brought the data to the table and drilled down through the data to where I showed them that their particular agency across their directorates, across all their subcomponents, had dozens of contracts to buy exactly the same laptop, down to the part number. This isn't just similar, these are the same item. And because one of them was a quantity of 20 versus one of them was a quantity of 2,000 or whatever the other characteristics were, that the swing on the cost of that per unit cost of that laptop was nearly double.
Wow.
Right. And in that particular conversation, the CIO turned to the team and said, is this true? Do we really have, how do we know whether people are buying exactly the same thing? And how do we begin to use the data to better understand where we can be saving potentially considerable amounts of money? So, Nancy, to Laura's point about this is a journey and engaging with the agencies and providing them with the data and helping to pinpoint where there are targets of opportunity it's a powerful thing when you can bring that data to the table for that discussion.
Thank you so much.
Laura and Bill, I have a question about conflict resolution. And this comes out of my experience at the state level, in state government, I'm from Oregon, where there have been major disputes between software developers, new systems developers and the state, leading to years of litigation. So I'm wondering that when there's a shared management approach, how do you anticipate handling conflicts that might arise between a vendor and a government agency?
That would certainly be something that we would support. It would be also something that we would work with the agency on to understand sort of how the task order is written, what's a conflict at the task order level, what's a conflict at the master contract level. So those become shared discussions, and Bob, to determine sort of where there might be challenges and where that conflict arose.
Would the ultimate decision in terms of whatever action might be taken by the agency, would that lie with the agency in your arrangement?
It would lie with the contracting officer, and if the agency had done the contract, it had done the task order, then it would be with the agency.
Okay, thank you.
There's one question from the audience that I'd like to read. This comes actually from the board's former IT panel member, Jim Williams, and it ties to the customer experience. And the question is this, and I'll publish it right now. Can the use of these common vehicles help agencies come together to design solutions, including cloud infrastructure and software tools that from a citizen perspective, help people navigate areas like benefits that can cross government agencies and allow for a same look and feel to citizens when navigating government portals? Can GSA facilitate those discussions?
Thanks for the question, Jim. I do think that there certainly are opportunities to be looking at shared services. I think what the Technology Transformation Service has done with login.gov is a great example of sort of a shared solution. For those of you who have used Global Entry, I'm sure you have had a chance to experience login.gov, but that's really a chance and an authentication tool that multiple agencies are able to deploy out of a single shared solution that was developed. So that, and then that also adds consistency from the citizen experience, because the agencies are logging in once. And the newest, the recent executive order on customer experience also highlighted some of those opportunities to create consistent customer experiences across agencies as well. Bill, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, so Laura, I was going to use login.gov as an example of what's actually being done today, but I do think even when we talk about kind of that direct contracting relationship, I think part of what GSA has done and looking at things like highly adaptive cybersecurity services, right? They are centralizing around delivery models, right? These are the common ways in which these types of services or goods are purchased. And so rather than having to kind of reinvent that every time an agency is trying to purchase those kind of common goods and services, they could pick up that template. And what that does ensure is that there's some consistency and commonality with how the government is going to industry, and in turn, what you see from citizen-facing services. So I think there's kind of a continuum with login.gov kind of on that high end of kind of a direct shared service to even in kind of common practices in contracting that will help with that as well.
Yeah, and I would actually add that, for example, we recently released we release ordering guides that help with those. That's another resource that gets published, is that we release ordering guides to help agencies walk through how do you order, what do you need to take under consideration as you develop requirements. We recently released one for Zero Trust Architecture, which is one of the main tenets of the cybersecurity executive order that was released back in May. And it was all that also provides a list of contracts where ZTA solutions and support are available through. So those are the types of shared resources as well that help create that consistent acquisition experience.
It would seem to, this is Bob again, it would seem to me that one of the many things that you're balancing is a level of consistency and uniformity and the benefits of that versus being nimble and being able to respond to unique challenges that an agency might have. And what I'm thinking about in this instance is some of the recent challenges that SSA may be facing in terms of reaching underserved communities that have difficulty navigating cyber entry into services. So is that the type of thing that you must have experience in terms of working together in order to figure out where you can find your maximum, your sweet spot, if you will, of bringing in efficiencies along with the unique needs of a particular service?
Absolutely, that hits on the core of what we're trying to do. We're not saying that everything is common, but we're saying where you can create consistency, there's value because of it simplifies it for the agency, because you're not having to put in those unique terms and conditions, because the baseline is already in the existing contracts. And we're also saying, though, that we recognize that agencies certainly need flexibility where they do have unique situations. So the idea is that by using the government-wide vehicles at the tier 2 and tier 3 level that I've talked about, accelerates the acquisitions for those things, and then creates more time for the agency's acquisition staff to focus on those mission critical and mission unique components. So it's trying to get to that balance of saying not everything's common, but where it is, let's take advantage of it, and then have the capacity to focus on what is unique.
Other board members, do we have additional questions right now? Hearing none. Conway, do we have additional public comments or questions?
No, I'll publish 2 comments that we received that touch on some of the cross-government building the communities with small businesses and vendors So I'll just post those, but I think we can keep on going.
Okay.
All
So-
right. I'm sorry, Bob, please.
Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, let's move into the profile that we developed on Social Security Administration. And a couple of observations, and this is one of the reasons we spent the time setting the stage with category management and the sets of resources, is that SSA has some interesting spending trends that I'll go over in the next few slides. And the bottom line is that SSA does have more spend under management than the rest of the government, but their profile in that spend under management looks a bit different than the rest of the government. And as SSA does it mostly through their own agency contracts versus the government-wide contracts, such as the tier 2 or best-in-class contracts that I've been talking about. And they also allocate, they also are allocating more money to software than the rest of government. As you'll see in some of these insights, we have a bit on methodology and where the data came from, but in the interest of time, I'll keep things moving. Next slide, please. So where SSA fits in the government-wide landscape is we have here sort of the top 15 agencies. So SSA is 11th with 2% of the government-wide IT spend. And that's been fairly consistent for SSA over the past 3 fiscal years. Next slide, please. Here's where we get into sort of the contract use that we've been alluding to. The top 15 contracts that SSA uses are shown on sort of the top half of this chart. So you can see where the money's been going. The lower chart shows what SSA's spend was as a percentage of that that contract government-wide. So in the cases where the bars on the lower chart are all light blue, it means that SSA is the only agency that spent money on that. When there's dark blue, it means that SSA was using a government-wide contract, and that and the light blue portion shows how much of a percent that was. SSA, so sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. About half of SSA's IT spend was through SSA-specific government-wide contracts, specific contract vehicles, and that compares to the government-wide IT, where we are really only seeing about 15% going through agency-specific vehicles. So this goes to that SSA has more spend under management. They're managing it. Their strategy for managing it is to have agency-specific contracts for SSA's use, rather than those tier 2 or tier 3 contracts. So next slide, please. This gives sort of a quick overview of the top 10 vendors that are government-wide, used in government-wide IT, and then the top 10 vendors that are used by SSA. And the government-wide, there's about 4 where SSA is using there's overlap with the top 10 government-wide vendors. And it also shows that when SSA is buying from IBM, Carahsoft, and Quest, that for IT software, that they are using ITC contracts for those acquisitions. And where they're using the SSA specific contracts is for Northrop Grumman, Leidos, and CGI for IT services. Next slide, please. So wanted to get a little bit into the small business spend. This is a key priority for the administration, and as well for the IT category. We've been looking very closely at our small business spend and looking at ways to really optimize it. And so in this case, SSA is 11th out of 90 out of the amount of money that's obligated, going back to the earlier slide that I shared that showed SSA as 11th in the government-wide landscape, but 16th in terms of the number of wide contracts. And so What that means is that SSA is putting more money on the contracts than other agencies are. And we theorize that this could be the reason SSA is working with fewer small businesses. Because if you look at this data, what you're seeing is that across the board, government-wide, 37% of the IT category spend went to small businesses, and in SSA, it was only 20%. Next slide, please. And then this gets into where does the sum tier line up? Going back to the earlier conversations, it shows the same trends that we've been talking about, which is that there is more spend under management at SSA. So they're using fewer tier 0 contracts than the rest of the IT category across the government, which is great. But they have a much greater number of 37% of their spend is going to those SSA specific tier 1 contracts versus 13% of government-wide spend that's going to agency specific tier 1 contracts. And then SSA subsequently has less money going to the tier 2 and the tier 3 contracts and smaller percentages. So SSA certainly has a very clear spend under management strategy based on this, and is very focused on those tier 1 contracts with it. Next slide, please. So there was also some requests around sort of the cyber. So moving away from let me pause actually on the SSA spending trends, because I'm going to be shifting into talking briefly about the cyber EO and customer experience for the last couple of slides.
Question, Laura, this is really for Bill. If you were to still be back, or even Laura, if looking at what you just said about SSA's, your analysis of SSA, what kind of follow-up questions might you be asking SSA when you just look at this overall big picture?
Bill, did you want to go first, or do you want me to?
I'll go first. I was being deferential, Laura, but I'll go. So Kim, I think what I would be looking at is a few aspects, right? The numbers on their own tell one story, but one thing that we really haven't talked about here that would be part of that is that because these are pre-competed contracts, because these big contracts are pre-competed, what the data shows very clearly is that they're also much less subject to protest. And when there are protests, that those protests are sustained, because as I mentioned before, all of those base terms and conditions have already been put in place. So when an agency builds a contract on top of a base contract, none of those things that were part of the base contract are subject to or can be protested. So for one, the questions that I would ask relative to that 37% block there is, are we seeing that we are having those strung out or having problems with getting those in place due to things like protests? And is there a way for us to be able to utilize these big contracts in order to expedite or accelerate our deployment of technology because that upfront work has been done? Kim, that's where my head would be. I will tell you that here in the city of Dallas, I have actually utilized the multiple award schedule multiple times, because as we've done our market research and we've tried to find qualified vendors for particular capabilities, I know that I can go through the multiple award schedule and very quickly be able to deploy that capability. I can get through that contracting process much more quickly than I might otherwise be able to do so. So speed to delivery combined with complications in and around protest and protest risk would be two of the things on the top of my list, Kim.
And then the reason I ask that's very helpful is I know that forever, it seems like the same companies come up again and again when it's time for SSA to rebid. It's bigger, it's big contracts. And I've often wondered about, kind of why that is. And maybe some of those questions that you're proposing get to some of that. That's something we'll have to think about and maybe further explore with SSA.
Yeah, I would add that I would also I read the IT modernization a report that the panel put together last year, and I would also add that the data tells one story, but what the data isn't telling us is what's the strategy, what's the thinking behind those decisions. It's very clear from the data that there is a strategy and decisions being made about how the spend is being managed. It's not accidental that you end up with the highest spend under management in an agency in government. That means and so I think it's very important to, the questions that I would be asking are, what's the business strategy? What are the outcomes? What's the mission that's trying to be achieved with this work? And those are the questions that immediately come to my mind when I look at a spend profile that has sort of the level of detail that we did here. And then we do have further, I kept this fairly high level for this conversation. We do have deeper data, but I wanted to be able to sort of walk through all of the category management and then walk through the spend profile at a high level for today's discussion.
And
Great,
Laura, if I could just jump in and add one more thing. I think that piece, Laura, that you're talking about in terms of the data, part of what Kim is getting at is kind of the diversity or the lack of diversity in vendors or suppliers that are within the enterprise. Part of the data that you have under the category management is that ability to take a look at similar items to see how they're priced, right? Because Kim, one thing I would worry about is that if what we are telegraphing to the vendors is that we will always return to the same set of vendors, are we really leveraging our buying power to get the best value for the purpose? And there is government-wide data across these vendors that can help with that kind of analysis. Laura, correct me if I'm misstating that.
There is. Yes, as I said, I kept the analysis for today's discussion fairly high level. Any other questions? All right, let me wrap up. I have a couple more slides, and I just wanted to wrap up talking briefly because there was a question. No, please go back, Jeremy. On the cybersecurity executive order. And I've referenced it a couple of times that this was released in May of 2021, and the cybersecurity executive order is really designed to have federal agencies strengthen federal capabilities, and it has a couple of sort of key components that are related. One is removing barriers to threat information sharing between the government and the private sector. Implementing stronger cybersecurity standards across the federal government. This gets back to the zero trust architecture, securing cloud services, some of the things that I touched on earlier. Improving the software supply chain security. This was in direct response to the SolarWinds hack back in late 2020. And so establishing baseline security standards for the development of software that's sold to the federal government, identifying critical software that's sold to the federal government. So, and having, requiring developers to have greater visibility into their software and making security data publicly available. So there's also some other things such as creating a standard playbook for responding to cyber incidents, and improving detection on cyber incidents on federal government networks. So there's a number of actions that are taking place across the federal government. GSA is working specifically with CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and NIST to work on these standards. And some of them are being put into the federal acquisition regulation, so they would apply to all contracts. Other things we're doing are really looking at how do we manage this for the contracts that GSA runs and for those other best-in-class contracts. So we are looking at how do we, especially for the contracts that are being established, getting that BIC designation, what are the opportunities to layer in all of these cybersecurity standards, and how do we do so? That is going to be an ongoing effort, and there'll be more to come on that, but did want to touch on sort of, since there were questions on that. The final slide I have is specifically targeting, next slide, please, Jeremy. The customer experience. So this gets back, this was from the executive summary of the essential change imperative, the report that was put together for the on the Social Security's IT modernization and future operations plan. I highlighted the findings from that because I wanted to link those back to the importance of what I talked about at the outset, and sort of has been the theme throughout today's conversation, which is the acquisitions support the larger vision for agency operations. And as we were talking about as a service and managed services earlier in the discussion, that link between acquisition and how that supports the program management is key. And so when we think about sort of what's being acquired, how it's being acquired, what acquisitions, what contract vehicles are being used, all of that should be in service of thinking about the customer experience, thinking about the vision, and thinking about the business operations of that agency. So just wanted to really emphasize that in summary, and we have talked at length about how category management, how contracts, these government-wide contracts can support some of the common elements, the common requirements, and what the advantages are there. And also the acknowledgement that agencies always have specific mission critical requirements that are not common, and that they still need to be able to have, be able to meet those needs as well. And then the final slide is just a series of resources that can be used as well. So Bill, let me pass it to you for a final word.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it. Again, I just want to thank the board for the opportunity for us to appear before you and provide you with this information. As I mentioned at the beginning, much of my professional career was spent with the Social Security Administration, and I always have I'm always thinking of Social Security and watching what's going on there. I think that there are opportunities for Social Security to move away from some of the customized approaches and look at how they purchase common goods and services, leveraging industry best practices, taking advantage of kind of the easy buttons that are being provided. And that will allow them, as Laura was mentioning earlier, to really spend their time and energy on those things that are unique and special to the agency, so that they really are best utilizing their resources and driving the best outcomes they can on behalf of the mission. So again, thank you. And
with that, Laura and Bill, we would genuinely thank you for sharing your very in-depth experience and information. You get to the core of what our board is doing is seeking greater efficiencies and enhancing customer experience so that customers can get the services that they need and expect from Social Security, and your work has been absolutely vital for that. And so I want to thank you again for participating in our speaker series and engaging in the discussion of federal IT acquisitions. And we want to thank all of our participants today for joining us and participating. And we wish you all a safe and warm weekend if you're in the DC area. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.